How many of you watching out there have a sibling? I have two brothers, and for those of you who don't have siblings, let me actually explain some basic sibling dynamics. One of the best parts about having a brother or sister is that you can blame them for stuff. Like you can point at them when something breaks in the kitchen. You can shovel your green beans on their plate so you can get dessert. Brothers and sisters, there are why phrases like "they did it first" or "it wasn't my fault" were invented. And even if you don't have a sibling, you probably had someone in your childhood who put the blame on you for something they did. A cousin, classmate, or a friend. Or maybe you had someone that you blamed for your mess ups. You see, our impulses as kids, they don't really change as adults or teenagers. We actually remain pretty skilled at avoiding responsibility and putting the blame on someone else. And so let me ask you a question. Do you remember the last time that you felt guilty? Maybe you copied a little too much of your friend's homework. Maybe you lingered a little too long on that website. Maybe you told your stepmom that you were going one place, and you did, but with a different crowd than you told her would be there. Or maybe you said you were studying the whole time, but you really were just binging a new show with your textbook open. There are all sorts of things to feel guilty about, and no matter how old we get, it seems like our reaction is a lot like a 5-year-old. Like we hide, stretch the truth, we make up excuses, or we try to cover it up altogether. When we feel guilty, we get really good at hiding. And we have all sorts of hiding tricks. We avoid our parents or the coaches in our lives. We try to not make eye contact with our teacher. We ghost our friends. We play it cool around the people in charge. We may even turn off our location services or hide our location. We do everything we can to act as though nothing happened, even though on the inside we know what we did was wrong and it's eating us up. And this isn't just what we do with other people. If we believe in God, chances are good that our guilt causes us to hide from Him too. You know, we know that God knows what we did is wrong, and so we back away from our relationship with Him. It's easy to hide something we did from the people around us, but it's much more complicated to hide from God. We can't actually run away from Him, and so we just start to make Him less and less a part of our lives. And so maybe you still go to life group, but when the conversation gets real, you don't speak up anymore. Maybe you still show up to church, but you're not really feeling it in worship anymore, and you just don't even know if you want to. Maybe you tell everyone that you have too much going on with school and sports, but really, you just don't want to participate in this faith stuff anymore. Honestly, no matter what it looks like for you, we all tend to let our guilt get in the way of our faith. Thankfully, we're not the first people to have these kinds of experiences with guilt. The Bible actually provides plenty of examples that we can learn from. And we're going to talk about one of them today. You see, for the last few weeks surrounding Easter, which just passed, we've been in a series called Afterlife, and we've looked at people who physically saw Jesus after the resurrection. See, when you see a friend who died now walking around alive, it changes you. And for many people, their lives were radically different after they saw resurrected Jesus. Their life after, or their afterlife, was dramatically changed. And that includes a guy named Peter. You see, Peter was one of Jesus' closest friends and a key leader during the early days of the Christian movement. But Peter had some run-ins with guilt and shame like we sometimes do. Peter was known as being Jesus' loud friend. We all have them. Or maybe you are the loud friend. You know, this actually got Peter in trouble from time to time. And the worst example of this happened when Jesus was sentenced to die on a cross. When Jesus was arrested, Peter literally cut off a guy's ear to defend Jesus. It's not a recommended strategy to prove your loyalty to a friend, but hey, at least he was there for Jesus, I guess. But then just hours later, when Jesus was given a sketchy, bogus trial, Peter stood nearby and he lied 3 separate times about his connection to Jesus. He denied even knowing the guy. And even worse, before any of this happened, Jesus told Peter that he would do exactly that. That he would deny being connected to Jesus. Jesus basically told Peter, I've experienced your loyalty so far, but when it comes down to the end, you won't be loyal to me. And Peter defends himself, assuring Jesus that he would never do that. And then at Jesus' lowest moment, that's exactly what Peter did. Jesus was arrested, he was tried and nailed to a Roman cross. And the last thing that Peter did was deny even knowing him. Honestly, I almost feel guilty for him. What a brutal end to his story, right? But see, like we've talked about in this series, Jesus' death was not the end of the story. Easter happens. The tomb is empty and Jesus is alive. The whole direction of the story changes, which is awesome, unless you're Peter. He probably had some mixed feelings. He probably thought, I'm so glad Jesus is back, but does that mean I have to face him after what I did to him? To Peter, it's impossible that the resurrection, was a reminder of the guilt that he felt. And if he felt guilt, I sometimes wonder if he ran through all of the same phases of guilt that we do. I wonder if he wanted to lie and exaggerate and defend himself or even hide from Jesus altogether. A few days later, Jesus was on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, and Peter was on the boat with the other disciples, and he saw Jesus. And so they went to the shore, and Jesus made breakfast, which is awesome. And he brought up the thing that no doubt was weighing on Peter's mind. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, in this passage here, John chapter 21, verse 15 to 17. Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said, you know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my lambs. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. So Jesus said, take care of my sheep. The third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my sheep. You see, Peter denied knowing Jesus 3 times. And then Jesus asks Peter, do you love me 3 times? In other words, for every time that Peter denied knowing Jesus, Jesus gives Peter another chance. And in giving him a chance, Peter knows he is loved and forgiven. And Jesus wants Peter to know that he has a second chance. He even tells Peter that he wants him to continue to lead, which is what he means by feed my sheep. Remember the whole flock thing? And this exchange is so interesting. Jesus asks Peter if he still loves him. As humiliating and terrible as it was for Peter to deny Jesus, here was a chance to make it right. Even though Peter may have given up on himself, Jesus hadn't given up on Peter. Peter could have given into his guilt and gone into hiding. But that's not what Jesus wanted for Peter. Jesus didn't want Peter's life to be defined by guilt. He wanted Peter to experience grace. Peter knew Jesus had been killed and he saw Jesus after he came back to life. This proved to Peter that Jesus was capable of offering him the grace he needed to forgive himself. And so the resurrection showed Peter the power Jesus had. And Peter's encounter with Jesus on the beach showed that Jesus chose to offer him powerful grace. The resurrection proved that guilt didn't have to destroy Peter's faith. Instead, grace could destroy his guilt and fuel his faith. Because of grace, Peter was no longer controlled by his guilt. Because of grace, Peter accepted the love Jesus offered him. Because of grace, Peter traveled around the world preaching about that same grace that changed his life. Think of it this way. Because of the resurrection, Peter knew he was forgiven. Now, I don't know what's been causing you to feel guilt, but chances are that the entire time we've discussed this topic, you've probably had something on your mind. If you're ready for something new, I want to give you a couple of steps that you can start taking right now. And the first is this: get real about where you feel guilt. This can be really, really tough, especially if you've hidden something so deep that you feel numb to it. But think about where you feel lingering guilt right now, and be honest with yourself about it. Acknowledge it, journal about it. You can even put it down in a note on your phone. Just get honest. And remember that guilt is no match for God's grace. Ask God to remind you that He's with you and for you even on those days. Ask Him to cover your guilt with the overwhelming reality of His grace. Listen, Easter matters for a lot of reasons. It shows us how big God's love is, what exactly God is like, and how God is more powerful than anything, including death. But Easter it also shows us that Jesus is bigger than our guilt. And if Jesus gives us grace, it's ours for the taking. And so when you feel those old guilt feelings kick in, ask God to give you a new reaction. And number 3, keep showing up and speaking up. Do the opposite of what guilt may have guided you to do in the past. Instead of hiding, show up in your small groups, a text thread. Show up at church gatherings. Show up to hang out with your friends. Show up to meetups with your life group leaders. And after the resurrection, Peter didn't hide from Jesus. It would have been easier to, but he didn't do it. And so, like Peter, let's keep showing up. The resurrection proved that our guilt is no match for God's grace. We don't have to let guilt change our faith anymore. And instead, we get to let grace change our guilt. And we know that talking about God's grace is one thing, but experiencing it is something else entirely. Because of the resurrection, Peter realized that grace is greater than guilt. And because of the resurrection, you can realize that too.